My name is Jacqueline Miller, and if old family legends are to be believed, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, though, to be honest, it took me a while to realize it, growing up surrounded by crystal, silk curtains, and the glitter of family portraits. You imagine the world works much the same way, with every house boasting a garden with a fountain and Stewart Pharmaceuticals cards on every table. Our family owned the largest drugstore chain in the state, and it wasn't just a business. It was something like a sacred legacy, a family cult that began with my grandfather, the man who built the business from scratch, and continued with my father, David Miller, for whom the word work wasn't a duty, but a breath of fresh air. Every evening, he would enter our vast Victorian house, where the air always smelled of furniture polish and roses from my mother's garden, take off his jacket, loosen the silk tie that cost more than any pharmacist's monthly salary, and begin talking about profits, contracts, and network expansion before he could even say good evening. At dinner, he loved to deliver speeches about record-breaking quarters, about how competitors had once again lost the race, and at these moments, my mother, Margaret, would look at him with the quiet approval with which women of his generation looked at the men who provided for the home. She would touch the pearl necklace at her neck, as if reminding herself that her husband's success was partly her own. Back then, I thought that was what family life was all about, a father who talked about business, a mother who nodded in response, and me, the future heir to it all. But my brother, James, sat next to him at the table, and he always seemed like he belonged to another world. Even at 12, when I was still playing with dolls, he was already thoughtfully moving his fork around his plate and gazing somewhere through the crystal chandelier. He wasn't interested in reports and graphs. He read about ancient civilizations, could spend hours telling me about the potsherds he'd found in the backyard, as if they were Egyptian artifacts, and tried to start a conversation about his archaeological discovery, but my father would only wave him off like a pesky fly. But I was different. I loved helping out in pharmacies. I loved watching elderly people gratefully accept medications that actually eased their pain, young mothers choosing vitamins for their children, how everything around them exuded movement, order, and meaning. By 14, I knew all the regular customers by name and could recite the inventory at each store by heart. When I told my father how I'd suggested a new layout or helped an elderly woman find the right product, he'd smile for the first time that day and say, "That's my girl." It was a recognition, almost a blessing, and I caught his rare smile like a ray of sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains of our house. Meanwhile, James retreated ever deeper into his own world, into books, archaeological journals, and dusty stories about people long gone, and my father increasingly took me to business meetings, where I'd sit quietly in a corner, wearing the new suits my mother had given me, and learn to watch, listen, and not interrupt. Watch and learn, Jacqueline, my father would say, peering at me over your glasses. Someday all this will be yours. And I believed. I loved his world, a world of facts, figures, and power, where every word could change someone's fate. My mother was also happy. Finally, one of us would carry on the family business. She liked to repeat that I had inherited my grandfather's acumen, and for her birthday she would give me formal suits and James yet another cheap book on ancient history, with an expression of mild annoyance, as if his interest in the past were just a temporary aberration. I remember well the evening when everything changed. We were sitting in the formal dining room under that very chandelier, which cost more than most cars, when James, looking straight at my father, quietly announced that he had decided to study archaeology. For a moment, it seemed as if even the light flickered. My father froze, then put down his silverware, and the clink of his fork on porcelain echoed in the silence like a gunshot. "What, James, is that an explosion?" he muttered. "My son is going to dig in the dirt?" My mother tried to smooth it over, her voice trembling, but her eyes betrayed the fact that deep down she agreed with him. James didn't argue, didn't make excuses. He simply said, "I've already been accepted into the program. Professor Anderson thinks I have real potential." And in that moment, when my father jumped up and shouted, "We're businessmen, not filth," I saw my brother as a grown man for the first time. His face hardened like stone. He rose from the table and said quietly, almost calmly, "Then perhaps I'm not a businessman," and he left. The plates remained untouched, the chandelier rang in the draught, and I suddenly realized that for the first time in my life I didn't know whose side I was on. That night, everything changed. It was as if the entire house, with its portraits of ancestors, massive staircases, and rustling antique clocks, suddenly froze and looked straight at me. After James left, I felt my father's gaze turn on me, heavy, almost tangible, and there was no longer any doubt in it. I was now the heir, his only hope, his continuation. I was no longer a backup plan, I had become a project. The future of Stewart Pharmaceuticals, and though the pressure was enormous, I found a strange pleasure in it, a sense of significance, the certainty that I was not just a daughter but an heir, or at least, I thought it was pleasure. Preston Business College became a new universe for me, prestigious, competitive, and full of the same spoiled trust fund kids who had known from childhood that life would deal them a silk pillow. I felt at home there, with my designer clothes, shiny phone, and the platinum credit card my father had given me like a pass to the future. The days passed in lectures, presentations, and endless discussions of success, profit, and efficiency, and I sincerely believed that all of this was my element. Until I encountered something that defied logic and calculation. I was struggling with some damned coding assignment, sitting in the library, staring at a screen that stubbornly showed errors, and almost whispering every curse word I knew under my breath, when suddenly a quiet voice nearby said, "Need help?" I looked up and saw a guy slid into the chair opposite me, as if afraid to disturb the air around him. He had the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen and a slight accent I couldn't place. Thus began something that would later change my entire life. His name was Alan. He was brilliant, the kind of student professors whisper about and others envy. He had a full scholarship, majored in computer science, and seemed to be able to make any code work on the first try. Professors cited his projects as examples, students fought to be on his team, but he remained remarkably simple and calm, as if success for him wasn't a reward but a byproduct of his work. I invited him for coffee, then again, and only on the third, having mustered up the courage, did I ask who his parents were. He answered simply, "Immigrants. We came from Syria when I was a child. My father worked as a security guard, my mother cleaned houses. I started programming at 12, on an old laptop I bought secondhand. I helped my parents pay the bills." I listened, and there was not a drop of self-pity or a hint of bitterness in his voice, only a calm conviction that life should be lived honestly. I felt almost awkward, because I didn't know what bills were, didn't know what it meant to work for food, but everything he said seemed genuine, and it was this authenticity, this simple honesty, that drew me in more and more. We started dating a month later. Alan wasn't like the guys I knew, perfumed, loud, overly confident in their impunity. He opened doors not because they taught him to in etiquette classes, but because he considered it a sign of respect. He took me not to fancy restaurants where photographing the food was more important than eating it, but to small, family-run eateries where the scent of cumin, toast, and warm air wafted through the air, and the owners greeted him by name, smiling as if he were their son. And I realized that for the first time in my life, I was actually laughing with someone, not feigning levity. 6 months later, as we were strolling around campus at sunset, he pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple silver ring, no diamonds, no frills, just the ring he'd been saving for, as he'd said, all summer. I couldn't hold back my tears. It was perfect because it hadn't a shred of ostentatious wealth, only meaning. When I told my father I was engaged, to my surprise, he was initially delighted, his eyes sparkled, and he immediately scheduled a large family dinner, inviting all his relatives and friends. Apparently he was already envisioning the union of two influential families and a company led by a new generation of millers. I even heard him tell someone on the phone that he would now have a worthy successor at his daughter's side. But the moment we entered our dining room, where candelabra flickered from the ceiling and the table was laden with silver and glasses, I realized I'd been wrong. My family's faces changed instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch, from delight to confusion. Aunt Patricia clutched her pearls nervously, as if they could shield her from reality. My mother's glass of champagne hovered halfway to her mouth, and my father, he sat at the head of the table, like a general before battle, and when he cleared his throat, the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. I felt Alan's hand tense under the table, and my heart sank. "So young," my father said, in that condescending tone I only heard in meetings. When he was reprimanding his subordinates, he drawled each word, as if addressing a bewildered child, and in that moment, for the first time, I saw that my father truly thought not of marriage, not of love, but of status, of family name, of blood. I felt a lump lodge in my throat, the kind you can't swallow because it's not made of flesh but of pain and shame, thick as molten lead, and in that moment, it seemed to me that the air in the dining room had become thick as molasses, and that even the chandelier above our heads seemed to dim with tension, suspended between the past and the present, in which everything that once seemed unshakable crumbles. Alan didn't move, he sat up straight, his shoulders squared, his gaze calm, but I saw a muscle twitch beneath his skin and his cheek, a barely perceptible movement that betrayed the effort it took him not to respond in the same tone my father had just used to break the air between us. "Sir," he said finally, quietly but firmly, and I realized it wasn't fear that made his voice firm, but self-respect. "I understand that you're worried about your daughter. I'd probably feel the same way if I were you, but you're wrong about me." "Wrong?" My father chuckled, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. "Boy, I've lived long enough to see how fairy tales like that end. You're nobody, you're just trying to be somebody." I wanted to intervene, but Mom, still holding the glass of water, placed her trembling fingers on my arm, as if warning, "Don't make it worse." Her pearls were indeed trembling, as if reflecting her inner fear, and I suddenly realized that for her, this entire dinner was like a survival test, only she didn't know the right answer. "Dad, please," I whispered, feeling my eyes burn, "you don't know him, you have no right to say that." But Father wasn't listening anymore. His face had turned the color of the bourbon he'd been pouring for himself before Alan walked through the door. He was the embodiment of rage, not the kind that flares up instantly, but the old, deep-seated kind, fed by the fear of losing power. "Jacqueline," he said, looking straight at me, "I've worked all my life to ensure you don't need anything. To ensure you never sit at the same table with people who remind you where they came from." "Where we come from, sir," Alan interrupted, and his voice held not indignation but pain, "quiet and human, doesn't determine who we become." There was a silence, so thick you could hear the old clock, inherited from my grandfather, ticking softly somewhere in the corner. Aunt Patricia stared at her plate, as if hoping the china would save her from embarrassment. Uncle George cleared his throat, not daring to look up, and Rebecca was no longer giggling, she was simply looking at Zayi with a strange expression, in which, for the first time, a flicker of respect appeared. "You dare talk to me about the future?" My father stepped closer, looming over the table, his voice low and hoarse. "You know nothing of the world my daughter lives in, you'll never understand what it's like to keep a straight face when the whole city is watching you." "Perhaps," Alan replied, his calm almost unbearable, "but I understand what it's like to hold your head up when the world wants you to keep it down." I felt something break in my chest, as if two lines of my life, always parallel, suddenly converged. The man I loved and the father I'd always feared losing stood opposite each other, and I knew one of them would break. My mother put down her glass, still half empty, and said in the tired voice one uses after years of feigned calm, "George, please, enough." But my father merely waved his hand. "Enough? No, Eleanor," his voice became sharp as a whip, "it will be enough when this young man stops thinking he can be part of our family." "Mr. Miller," Alan said quietly, rising, "I never asked you for permission to be with your daughter, I only asked for respect." And there was so much dignity imbued in those words that even my father seemed momentarily speechless. He stood there, looking at him with an expression of rage mixed with confusion, as if he couldn't understand how this boy, born on the other side of the world, dared to speak to him as an equal. And I just sat and listened to my home crumble, not the walls, not the ceiling, but the fragile balance between love and fear that I'd lived on all these years. The worst part wasn't even my father screaming, but the fact that everyone around me, my relatives, the people I considered close, sat as if petrified, nodding, as if he were simply voicing their shared thoughts, as if his cruel words weren't a flash of rage, but the truth, finally spoken aloud. I looked at them and realized that no one was going to stand up, no one would say, "David, that's enough." No one would even look at Alan with sympathy. On the contrary, they seemed to have gathered around their father like an entourage around a monarch, reveling in his power and their complicity in this scene of humiliation. Dad didn't stop, his face twisted, his lips trembled, his eyes gleamed with anger, and he pointed a finger at Alan as if passing judgment. "I see right through you, boy," he spat, his voice like the rasp of a drunken preacher. "You're just another swindler with a pathetic history trying to snatch a piece of my daughter's inheritance." "David, please." Mom intervened, not to stop him or defend Alan, but rather to soften the impact. To make the right impression in front of the guests, she turned to me with a forced smile, trying to feign concern, and said in a tone that sent a chill down my spine. "Honey, you're too young to be making decisions like this. You need to finish college, then work for the company for a while, like we planned, and then think about marriage, but please, with someone more suitable." I felt my heart slowly sink, as if my whole life had been reduced to those few words, cold, calculating, spoken with a smile that reeked of hypocrisy. Uncle George cleared his throat, as he always did when about to interject a reasonable comment. "Well, David, I think he just wants to get into the drugstore chain. Those guys are cunning, believe me. Remember that guy Martinez who tried to date Rebecca?" "Same old story." "Oh, right," Aunt Patricia interjected, leaning closer to Mom as if discussing a Thanksgiving recipe. "Same thing, charming until they get what they want." I looked at Alan, wanting to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. He sat motionless, as if afraid any movement would be perceived as a challenge, with only his eyes slightly strained and his fingers gripping his glass of water white with tension. He didn't speak, but his silence was louder than any scream, proud, hard one, filled with a dignity that seemed to be missing from everyone at the table. "And what kind of future can you offer her?" Father chuckled, leaning back in his chair as if he'd gotten his way. "Life in some dump where the kitchen is the size of a closet? Microwave dinners while you waste time on your ridiculous internet money?" Something inside me snapped, as if a thin string had snapped right in my chest. Everything around me became unbearably clear: the glint of the crystal, my mother's uneven breathing, the scent of mint from the teapot, the dull tick of the clock, and suddenly I stood up, abruptly, almost noisily. The chair flew back and hit the wall. "Enough," my voice trembled, but I didn't intend to hold it back. "Stop it. All of you, just stop it. You should be ashamed." My mother gasped, pressing her hand to her throat, as if my words had hurt her more than my father's rudeness. "Jacqueline," she whispered, as if I'd said something obscene. "No, Mom, I'm done," I said, feeling my hands burn with rage. "You're all acting like arrogant, prejudiced snobs, and if you can't see a person beyond their origins, then maybe I should stop seeing you as my family." I reached for Alan's hand, and he stood up without saying a word, just looking at me with a gaze that contained everything: gratitude, love, pain, and that heavy knowledge that there was no turning back. "Let's go," I said quietly. "I can't stay here anymore." We walked toward the door, and I felt eyes on my back, heard muffled murmurs and whispers, as if someone were commenting on a play whose ending everyone knew in advance. As I reached for my coat, my father's voice boomed across the foyer like a clap of thunder. "If you walk out that door, Jacqueline, you'll regret it. After everything we've done for you, after all the money we spent on your education, after securing your future, you owe us." I turned around, for the last time, and, meeting his gaze, she said calmly, almost in a whisper, but so that each word cut the air like a blade, "The only thing I owe you, Dad, is the courtesy of leaving, instead of telling you directly what I'm thinking of you now." He shouted something after me, about debts, about responsibilities, about how I should remember who I am, but I was no longer listening. We left the house, and the cold evening air stung my skin, as if reminding me, I'm alive. Some debts, I realized, are never worth paying. The year flew by like a dream. Alan and I graduated from college, he with honors in computer science, I with a degree in business. We rented a small apartment on the outskirts, and, contrary to all my family's gloomy predictions, we were happy. True happiness had nothing to do with china sets, heirloom chandeliers, and the words decent and appropriate. And when Alan that summer, on a warm evening under the streetlights, dropped to one knee and asked if I wanted to stop waiting and finally become his wife, I didn't even hesitate. I spent half a day crafting every detail, choosing the words and nuances, as if my life itself depended on how my voice would sound in this small electronic window through which I was about to announce to the world that love had finally won. I chose a photograph of Alan and me standing at sunset, the light falling softly on his shoulders like a blessing, and my eyes reflecting the simple and unconditional happiness that only comes when you have nothing left to prove. Beneath this photograph, I wrote words I poured my heart into, about how love knows no boundaries, that it is stronger than prejudice, stronger than fears, stronger than the walls people build between themselves in the name of tradition, and, pressing publish, I closed my eyes for a second, as if sending a letter into the sky, hoping it would reach those still able to hear. The replies started pouring in almost immediately, and at first I thought they were congratulations. Notifications poured in one after another. My phone vibrated in my hand, while I smiled, expecting kind words, but instead of joy, venom arrived. "I can't believe you're still with him," Cousin Rebecca wrote, accompanying her message with a heart, as if mocking. "Don't count me out," Hunter added, not forgetting to tag my photo with a sad emoji. Then Aunt Patricia appeared, her words, as always, dripping with venom hidden beneath the sugar coating. "Your poor parents, they must be horrified. We raised you better, Jacqueline." And then Uncle George, whose moral code always depended on the thickness of his wallet. No self-respecting Miller would participate in this farce. Each new notification hit harder than the last, and soon the phone screen turned into a black ribbon of incessant attacks. When Mom's message popped up, I simply froze, unable to even breathe. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. Don't wait for us there." I don't remember exactly when the tears started rolling down my cheeks. I just suddenly realized I couldn't see the screen, that my fingers were shaking, that the world was narrowing to the sound of my own sobs. Alan hugged me, sat next to me, stroked my hair, and whispered that maybe I should wait, give them time, take my time, but I shook my head, wiping away the tears with the back of my hand. "No," I said hoarsely, "I'm tired of waiting for them to decide if I'm worthy of my own happiness. We'll get married, with or without them." I wasn't expecting James to come. My brother was in Egypt, busy with his excavations. Everything in his life was always connected to antiquities, the sand and dust of centuries. But 2 days before the wedding, the door to our apartment swung open, and there he stood, tanned, covered in desert dust, tired, and smiling in a way only he could. "You didn't think I'd miss my little sister's wedding, did you?" he said, hugging me so tightly that for a second I felt small. "And besides, someone has to walk you down the aisle, right?" The wedding was modest, but so beautiful that I can still smell the jasmine in the air when I close my eyes. We held it in the garden, where hundreds of little lights hung from the tree branches, and when they were lit, the evening turned into a fairy tale. Alan's family sat on one side, warm, noisy, genuine, laughing, crying, applauding, as if I'd been one of them from the start. My side was almost empty, only James, standing next to me, and a few distant relatives brave enough to defy the family boycott. But even with this tiny number of guests, I felt happier than ever in those marble halls, where everything always smelled of coolness and approval. A year passed, a year full of quiet work and discoveries. Alan's career took off. He developed a project that attracted the interest of a major tech company, and soon became their chief consultant. Inspired by his confidence, I started my own consulting business, small but honest, built without the support of family connections or other people's money. We moved slowly, step by step, brick by brick, creating our lives from scratch. Not luxurious, but real. And then the letter arrived, a thick, cream-colored envelope with gold embossing gleamed with the words, "Your presence is required, David Miller's 60th birthday." My hands trembled. After everything that had happened, the cold stares, the insults, the silence, they suddenly decided I had to come, or maybe this was their twisted form of reconciliation? I showed the letter to Alan, and without a word, he took my hand, squeezed it tightly, and quietly said, "It's your choice, my love, but whatever you decide, I'm here." The night of the party, I chose a dress I'd made myself, simple, elegant, with a hint of lavender that reminded me of freedom. Alan wore his best suit. I spent a long time choosing a gift for my father, something symbolic, not ostentatious. In the end, I settled on a rare first edition of his favorite business book, the very one he'd once read to me as a child, telling me how success is built. I wanted him to understand. I hadn't turned away. I still remembered. I still knew how to love, no matter what. When we entered the house, the air seemed to freeze, conversations died down, dishes clinked, someone coughed, but not a single person spoke. It was like that first night at dinner, when I first saw their true colors. I approached my father and handed him the gift. He took it, looked at the packaging, and without a second thought, tossed it aside. The paper rustled, the gift hit the floor and rolled under the table, like something unwanted. And then dinner began, a performance of politeness, constructed like an elegant drama. Every question, every smile, Every comment was carefully crafted with one purpose: to hurt. When I think back to that evening, my insides clench, not from pain, but from some strange mixture of pity and release, as if I were witnessing my own rebirth live on television, beneath the flashing crystal chandeliers and the clink of glasses, where every smile from my relatives was a blade, and every toast a gunshot. I saw Alan's calm demeanor, his eyes steady but steely, and I knew that if he stood now, it would be for me, not for himself. He squeezed my hand under the table, leaned in slightly, and whispered, "Breathe, Jacqueline, they have no power over you anymore." And in that moment, amid the rustling of dresses and the suppressed giggles, I felt truly free for the first time. My father spoke with the solemn arrogance with which he usually announced the results of his corporation's quarterly results, oblivious that today they were talking not about numbers, but about his own daughter, whom he was about to erase from his life like a bad deal. His glass glistened as he slowly said, "As of this moment, Jacqueline Miller is no longer part of the family. She has lost everything." The room erupted in applause, as if he had just signed a lucrative contract. Cousin Michael, the one my father now named his successor, stood like some pathetic student who had memorized the acceptance speech and said, "Thank you, Uncle David, I won't let you down." His voice trembled not with excitement, but with delight. He had been waiting for this moment, like an actor in his only scene. My mother sat nearby, in a perfectly tailored pearl-colored dress, clapping as if she were watching an Oscar. I looked at them all, at those who had given me life but taken my soul, and I knew it was all over. "Come on, Alan," I said, keeping my voice low, because the rage no longer needed to be loud. It was deep inside, thick, calm, icy. He stood next to me, his arm tightly wrapped around my waist, and we walked toward the exit without looking back, even though someone whispered behind me. Someone laughed, and my father shouted something like, "You'll regret this." But I knew it was he who would regret it. The years after that flew by like scenes from a new film, where I no longer played a supporting role in someone else's script. Alan worked tirelessly, turning his ideas into the living breath of progress, and I saw his eyes light up when he talked about new developments, as if he'd finally proven to the world, and perhaps even to himself, that a person without privilege could build an empire out of thin air if he believed in what he was doing. His investments in cryptocurrency, which my father had once scoffed at, became the foundation on which Tech Vision Enterprises grew. Proud, strong, almost mythical, I helped him with the business, organized strategic meetings, wrote presentations, sought out partners, and every detail, every victory, no matter how small, became ours. Just 3 years had passed, and Alan's name was featured in business journals, at conferences, on magazine covers, as an example of a new generation of entrepreneurs, those who weren't born with a silver spoon but forged their own destiny. His company was already worth over $500 million, but for me, that wasn't what mattered most. The real treasure was that he never changed, the same kind, humble man who knew how to listen and laugh, who could put off an important call for an evening dinner with me in the kitchen, with a bottle of wine and a plate of pasta cooked in an old frying pan I bought back in my student days. Sometimes, as I lay next to him at night, listening to the rain rustle outside, I caught myself thinking that perhaps this is what happiness is: not loud, not flashy, but quiet, confident, real. I no longer thought of my family with pain, only with a slight sadness, as of people who chose walls instead of bridges, but somewhere deep down, in the farthest corner of my soul, I knew that one day they would knock again. And when that happened, I would no longer be the woman who once cried for their approval. I would be Jacqueline, the wife, the partner, the woman who persevered. I looked at them, almost in disbelief. The same faces that had once turned away from me with cold condescension now beamed with smiles full of sticky warmth, behind which hid a desperate desire to be close again, to belong, to reclaim lost power. My mother reached out to me, her hands shaking, not from remorse but from nervous anticipation, as if she didn't know how to approach the daughter she'd erased from her life years ago for the sake of social peace. "Jacqueline, darling, you look so beautiful," she said in the same sweet voice she'd once used to admonish waiters or smile flatteringly at her friends' husbands when they were making deals with my father. I felt Alan lightly squeeze my hand under the table, as if warning, "Don't let them hurt you again, don't open old wounds for their convenience." My father stood nearby, wearing the same expression he always wore before important negotiations, slightly arrogant, but framed by a false warmth, carefully rehearsed in front of the "Mirror, we're proud of you, Alan," he said, as if each word took effort. "Everything you've achieved deserves our respect. I'm glad you're part of our family." His gaze swept the room, catching the interested eyes of the guests, as if he were trying to convince not me, but the entire world, that he was a kind, noble father, capable of forgiveness, and I realized his speech was addressed not to me, but to the audience, as always. I smiled, not from joy, but from a cold understanding of how flawlessly they played their parts, even when the stage was crumbling. "I wonder," I said quietly, looking straight into his eyes, "is this the same Alan you called a gold digger? Or has his success now become real enough for you to respect him?" My father's face twitched, barely noticeable, as if a shadow of memory flitted across it, the evening when he disinherited me, and I rose from the table holding the hand of my then dashed little man. He cleared his throat, looking away, and changed the subject, as if I'd said something inappropriate. "You know, dear," my mother interjected, leaning closer, "we were thinking about you all the time. I just didn't know how to approach it. It was all a misunderstanding. We'd like to start over." I felt something inside me tighten painfully, not from resentment, but from the memory, from how many nights I'd cried, waiting for these very words, and how strangely empty it felt to hear them now, when they no longer mattered. Alan, always polite and tactful, smiled slightly and said, "We appreciate your words, Mr. and Mrs. Miller. Life, you know, is long, sometimes new paths to understanding are found in it." I saw my mother literally blossom from this. His kindness was like salvation to her. As if one soft word had washed away years of their contempt. But I knew he said it not for them, but for me, because he understood that what I needed that evening wasn't revenge, but closure. I sat next to him, feeling our fingers intertwined under our tablecloth, and I understood that all of this, their false smiles, compliments, outstretched hands, no longer had power over me. Everything had changed. Now we were not the children they taught to worship wealth. Now we were the ones who chose whom to let into our lives. While my mother continued to talk about the new kindness in the family, how they always believed in me, I could see out of the corner of my eye a line of my relatives forming around Alan, the same ones who had once mocked his accent, his suit, his dreams. Now they were bustling about like participants in a cheap carnival, vying with each other to offer him business cards, showering him with false compliments, recalling how they had always known he was a man of the future. Aunt Patricia, shining like a Christmas window, explained, "Your husband is simply magnificent, Jacqueline. Did you know he was in Forbes?" I had to suppress a grin. The same woman who had once giggled at Alan for not knowing which fork to use for a salad now practically trembled with delight when she said his name. I looked at them and thought how strange the world works. When a person crosses a certain threshold of success, those who once despised them begin to worship them. Alan smiled, thanked them, and carried himself with dignity, as if this wasn't a humiliation for him, but an opportunity to set an example, that generosity can be greater than pride. I watched him and realized I was proud of him not for the millions or the recognition, but for how he remained himself, despite everything. And yet, when Mom leaned over again and whispered, "You're not angry anymore, are you? We were young, stubborn, we missed you," I felt my eyes fill with tears, not from joy, but from relief. "Mom," I said quietly, "I stopped being angry a long time ago, I just don't expect anything anymore." She froze, unsure how to take this, and I smiled and raised my glass. "For a change," I said, and in that moment I realized I was truly free. They flinched, but quickly put on their familiar masks, the same ones they wore to walk into any room, pretending to be masters of the world. Dad cleared his throat, loosening his tie slightly. I noticed it was no longer the same brand, not from his favorite Italian tailor, but most likely a hastily purchased one at some outlet. "Darling," he said with a strained smile, "family is family." I immediately felt the air around us thicken. There was always something hidden behind that phrase, and I knew that this something was about to emerge, and indeed, soon, behind the soft greetings, the real reason for their sudden friendliness emerged, the very reason for which, apparently, all the previous humiliations and harsh words were worth forgetting in one evening. The story spilled out like an overheated kettle. Their beloved Michael, the pride of the Miller family, had made a catastrophic mistake. His decision to cut costs had nearly destroyed Stewart Pharmaceuticals, the very same company that had long been considered a symbol of stability, reputation, and family grandeur. He'd signed contracts with shady suppliers, and now they were facing lawsuits for selling counterfeit drugs. The FDA is already investigating, my father whispered, as if afraid one of the guests might overhear. He lowered his voice to an almost conspiratorial whisper, adding, "The banks won't touch us, but we're in trouble, princess. The legal fees alone are worth it." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, though I knew her tears weren't from pain, but from fear. "We had to mortgage everything, Jacqueline." Her voice trembled like a thin thread. "The house, the jewelry collection, even the old yacht, you remember?" Dad reached across the table, not to his daughter, but to my husband, Alan, placing his hand on his arm as if they had suddenly become close. "I know we started off on the wrong foot," he said with feigned sincerity, "but your family is our family now, and family helps family, right?" I saw Alan's face soften. He was a man whose heart had never been able to close itself to the pain of others. His kindness was always both a blessing and a curse. He was about to reach for the inside pocket of his jacket where his checkbook lay, but I covered his hand with mine, cold and hard as stone. "Family helps family," I repeated, looking my father straight in the eye, and my voice took on such a steely edge that even my mother, accustomed to commanding a room with a single glance, leaned back in her chair. I suddenly felt almost amused. There was a certain dark irony in it. I remembered how, years ago, my mother had told me we were no longer a family when I chose the wrong man. "Actually," I added, looking at them, "haven't you disowned me twice, Dad?" His eyes instantly darkened. His voice was the same as it had been when I was a child and had misbehaved, low, threatening, sending shivers down my spine. "After everything we've done for you," he began, but I interrupted. "You taught me some valuable lessons, Dad, like, don't give money to strangers. Isn't that what you always said?" His face flushed with that same shade of anger I'd known since childhood, thick, purple, terrifying. "You ungrateful little," he breathed. I leaned forward and said quietly but clearly, "And you taught me to maintain high standards, remember?" Just then, the wedding DJ, unaware of the Tennessee Williams-esque drama unfolding at the Miller's table, asked everyone to raise a glass to the newlyweds' happiness, and I, still looking my father in the eye, said, "Sorry, but I don't raise a glass to those who sell counterfeit drugs to sick people to save a few bucks." My father exploded. He jumped to his feet, the chair crashing behind him. "How dare you, after everything I've done for you? I raised you, educated you, provided a roof over your head." I stood up calmly. "And disowned me," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Twice, 3 times, if you like. Disown me again if it makes you feel better, but my answer won't change." I took Alan's hand, and we left the hall to the sound of his shouts, the whispers of the guests, the clink of glasses clinking in celebration of someone else's happiness. My father's curses followed us to the door, but for the first time, I felt no pain. On the contrary, a quiet, confident calm spread somewhere within me. That was 3 years ago. James, my cousin, still writes to me occasionally, even though I don't ask. He told me Stewart Pharmaceuticals had gone bankrupt, and the house, the very mansion where I grew up, had been auctioned off. My parents moved to a smaller apartment, sold my mother's jewelry collection, and even the old Bentley to cover legal costs. Sometimes I think back to that long ago dinner when my father first called Alan a fortune hunter, and every time, I catch myself thinking that life has a strange sense of humor. It likes to show people who they really are. My poor immigrant, the one who came to me penniless and without pedigree, built an empire on hard work, perseverance, and honesty, and my respected father, who taught me pride and status my whole life, lost everything because of greed and fear. But if these years have taught me anything, it's that true wealth isn't found in numbers, houses, or names on door plaques. True wealth is having someone by your side who holds your hand even when the whole world is against you, someone who supports you, not humiliates you, and in that sense, I am, perhaps, the richest woman in the world.